Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome learners to our macroeconomics course of the BCom Honours program. Continuing with our previous series of lectures, we are here again with the Unit 2 of the same course, and the topic of today's discussion would be aggregate demand. So let us see that what are we going to learn in today's lecture. Let me first give you an outline of the lecture and what will be your learning outcomes. We will understand what do you mean by aggregate demand curve and what is the nature of this curve. We will also understand the derivation of the aggregate demand curve, and then we will see that what influences the shift of the aggregate demand curve. Before moving further, let me take you back to the big picture with which we started this Unit 2. We said initially we understood the Keynesian cross, that is how the equilibrium level of income and output is determined in the Keynesian model. From this we derived the IS curve. Then we understood that what is the demand of money through the liquidity preference theory, and then we derived the LM curve. Together we combined the goods market curve, that is the IS curve, and the LM curve, and we got the ISLM model in the lecture before this. Today, using the same ISLM model, we will be talking about the aggregate demand curve. And then we will be seeing later on in the next lectures the aggregate supply curve, and then understand the total model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So learners, the focus of today's lecture would be on the aggregate demand curve, which we will be using by way of the ISLM model. Now let us first get introduced to this concept of aggregate demand. The aggregate demand curve basically is all the combination of output and aggregate price level for which both the goods market and money market are in equilibrium. That is, this curve, that is the aggregate demand curve, is giving you a relationship between various levels of output and the corresponding price levels. So, this particular curve captures an inverse relationship between the aggregate price level and output. Learners, you must have already seen the behavior of this demand in microeconomics, where you have studied law of demand, and there we saw that there is an inverse relationship between price and the demand of one good. But remember, this is what we are doing today is macroeconomics. Therefore, our focus is on the total demand of all the goods and services, and the price is not only of one particular good, but we are talking about the aggregate price level. Hence, this aggregate demand curve would capture the relationship of all the goods and services, that what happens to the aggregate demand of all the goods and services at different price levels. We will see later on that this particular curve is also a downward sloping curve, or this aggregate demand curve is giving an inverse relationship between aggregate price and output, meaning when the price level is more, the output level is less, and vice versa. However, for deriving this particular aggregate demand curve, or for understanding the relationship between the aggregate price level and the output, we will be using the ISLM framework. Why? Because we have just said that this demand curve is talking about the combination of output and price level, where both the goods market and the money market are in equilibrium. So we will be using the ISLM framework. However, I would draw your attention that initially when we did your ISLM framework in the previous lectures and we found the equilibrium level of rate of interest and output, we had assumed that the prices will not change. But in order to derive the aggregate demand curve, we are going to relax this assumption of constant prices, and we will see that what happens that if the price level changes, then how do we map the price levels with the aggregate output. But again, I am repeating, we will be deriving this with the help of your ISLM framework. Now let us move forward and see that how do we do that. So we will be talking about the derivation of the aggregate demand curve. We have just said that we will be using ISLM framework, that is we will be using the curves of the goods market and the money market, and then understand this relationship between aggregate price level and output, which is given by the aggregate demand curve. Here again we will see that how this happens. Say this LM curve, if you remember, this curve is talking about the equilibrium in the money market. That is, LM curve is talking about all those points where the demand of money becomes equal to the supply of money. But this demand of money is the real demand of money. What is real demand of money? Real demand of money is essentially the nominal demand, real money supply is essentially the money supply, the nominal money supply, which is getting divided by the aggregate price level. Similarly, real demand of money is the nominal demand of money divided by the price level. That is, we are deflating the impact of the prices, and then we are saying that what is the actual purchasing power of your money. So real money supply, if you say, is the nominal money supply, let us say, which is depicted by capital M. This is getting divided by the price level capital P. So the real money supply would be equal to money supply, that is nominal money supply, divided by the price level. So as we have just said, the LM curve is the locus of all the income combinations where the real demand of money becomes equal to the real money supply, and real money supply or the real demand of money is the money supply divided by the price level, or real demand of money is the money demand divided by the price level. So here the role of price level is coming into picture. This would mean that any change in this price level will have an impact on your real money supply, because if prices changes, your real money supply would change, and this would in turn have an impact on your LM curve. So the aggregate price level is coming into picture here, which we had previously assumed to be constant, but now we are keeping this aggregate price level to vary. So a change in the price level will bring a change in the real money supply, and hence your LM curve would change. Now let us see that how this happens, and we will understand it graphically, and I'm sure after this it would be crystal clear to you that how a change in price level is having an impact on the LM curve and hence interest rates and the output. So again we will take the interest rates on the y-axis and output on the x-axis. This red line is your IS curve showing a goods market equilibrium. The blue line, which is upward sloping, is LM0 we have said here. That is, LM0 is locus of all the points where the money market is in equilibrium or the real money demand is equal to real money supply. So let us say LM0 is equal to M0, that is the money supply, nominal money supply in that particular time period, divided by the price level of that time period. Now if, let us say, there is an increase in price, that is your price rises, price levels rise from P0 to P1. Money supply, nominal money supply is constant, But because the prices have increased, we will see that your LM curve has shifted upwards because your real money supply has decreased. So because of an increase in price level from P0 to P1, the LM curve, the money market curve, has shifted. Even though the nominal money supply is still constant at M0, in both the cases, if you see carefully, for both LM1 and LM0, the nominal money supply is same, it is unchanged. But because the price level in this case has increased from P0 to P1, the LM curve has shifted upward from LM0 to LM1. So what do we see because of that? Because of this, the new equilibrium is achieved where LM1 becomes equal to IS and it is at a higher rate of interest with a lower level of output. Similarly, if there is a fall in prices, let us say the prices fall from P0 to P2. Again, the nominal money supply is constant, but because there is a fall in the price level, we see that the real money supply has increased. So, the curve of LM shifts from LM0 to LM2. So, we have seen an outward shift of the LM because the price level has decreased. Because of this decrease in price level, the real money supply has increased. A new equilibrium between the money market and the goods market is achieved at a lower rate of interest I2 and a higher level of output Y2. So what do we see, learners, here is that a change in price level is shifting your LM curve because with a change in price level, the real money supply will either decrease or increase and hence a new equilibrium level at which both the money market and the goods market are at equilibrium will be at a different rate of interest and different level of output. So this is just to explain you that how a change in price level has an impact on the LM curve. Now using the same concept, we will be deriving your aggregate demand curve. So we will start with a situation where you are taking rate of interest on the y-axis and output on the x-axis. That is, we will be deriving the goods market and money market equilibrium in the upper graph. And then from that, we will be getting a relationship between aggregate price level and the output. That is, we will be talking about the concept of aggregate demand. So what we have already defined is that aggregate demand is giving a relationship between price levels and the output. What output? That level of output in which both money market and goods market are in equilibrium. So this graphical representation will help us to derive the aggregate demand curve. So if you see the upper card, we have drawn the IS curve, that is the goods market curve. Let us say the price level is P1. So you can see this blue dotted line in the graph given below this above graph. So your price is P1. Again, at this level of P1, you have the money market curve LM, which is upward sloping, shown by this blue line, that when the price level is P1, this is your LM curve. So this is our initial money market curve. You get an equilibrium at the rate of interest R1. Which equilibrium? This R1 is that rate of interest where IS is equal to LM, or money market equilibrium and goods market equilibrium simultaneously has been achieved. So the rate of interest at this point is R1. You have Y1 level of output. So we extend this Y1 level of output, this dotted line, you extend it to the relationship between price and Y. So this black dot is showing that point where price level 1 corresponds to the Y1 level of output, and this Y1 level of output is that level of output at which both money market and goods market are in equilibrium. Now let us see what happens if the price level changes. Now let us say price rises from P1 to P2, which is shown by this orange dotted line. So price has gone up from P1 to P2. What will happen to LM? You're right. Because of this, the LM curve will shift upwards. Because the prices have risen, the real money supply will decline. We have just seen it in the previous slide that with the change in price level or the increase in price level, because the real money supply declined, we see a new LM curve at a price level of P2 shown by this upward sloping orange line. Because there is a disequilibrium in the money market, we see a new equilibrium getting achieved at a point where LMP2 is equal to IS, which is at a higher rate of interest. Why has this happened is because the prices have increased, the real money supply has decreased. A decrease in real money supply has pushed up the rate of interest in the markets. Because supply is less and demand is more, rate of interest has gone up to R2. A new equilibrium level of output is achieved just Y2, which is at a lower level compared to that level of output Y1. So, because of a rise in price, we see that the rate of interest has gone up and the level of output has come down. So this Y2, if we plot it back to your price output relationship, you get a new point which is corresponding to higher level of price P2 but at a lower level of output Y2. If you join these 2 points, that is the combination of P2Y2 and P1Y1, the curve that you get is called as the aggregate demand curve. So we see that this curve is downward sloping, showing that at a higher level of prices, the output is less. At a lower level of price P1, output is more Y1. Now, again we will just see that whatever we have discussed, we have said that we have deriving the aggregate demand curve. Why it is downward sloping? We have just derived the aggregate demand curve by seeing that what happens if the price change. So let's see if the price increases. Let us say in our case the price increased from P1 to P2. There is a fall in the real money supply. There is a fall in real money supply. How did we calculate? We said it is money supply divided by the price level. A fall in real money supply led to a shift in LM curve to the left or inward. We see a higher rate of interest because of that, because the supply of money is less, demand is still the same, hence the rate of interest has risen. What happens because of this? Because there is a higher rate of interest, the demand for investment will also go down. We have seen in the previous lectures that there is an inverse relationship between rate of interest and investments. Because rate of interest is the cost of investment. If the rate of interest is more, the investments will be less. So your investment declines because we get a new equilibrium, and hence because of that your Y will decline. So a downward sloping curve has happened because the prices have increased. An increased price has led to a lower level of output. So aggregate demand curve, we have said, is downward sloping, or it is giving an inverse relationship between the output and the price levels. Aggregate output and the price levels. It is a downward sloping curve happening because if the prices have increased, your real money supply has fallen a fall in the real money supply has pushed up the rate of interest. A higher rate of interest has not only impacted the excess money supply in the money market, but it also had an impact on the goods market because investments demand was less because of higher rate of interest, and hence we see a fall in Y from Y1 to Y2. Similarly, you can draw on your own to see that what happens if the prices, let us say, decline from P1 to P3. That exercise, I leave it on you, and you will get a similar relationship, that an inverse relationship you will see between prices and the output. After this, let us understand that what leads to a shift in the aggregate demand. Because we are talking about an equilibrium output of both simultaneous equilibrium in the money market and the goods market, what we will see is that any change in the monetary or the fiscal policy or any exogenous variable other than the price will shift the IS or the LM curve. Now, if there is a shift in IS or the LM curve, it will also shift the aggregate demand curve. But please remember and pay attention, what we are saying is that the price level will remain constant. Any change happening in the variables other than the price will shift the IS or the LM curve. What we are saying is that this shift in the aggregate demand curve will take place either due to operation of the monetary or the fiscal policy. What we have seen in the previous slides were that there was a change in the price levels. Here we are saying a shift in the aggregate demand curve will take place because prices are constant, but there is a change in exogenous variables which has been brought about due to your changes in the monetary or the fiscal policy. That is, your maybe the money supply has changed, there is an expansionary monetary policy, or your government expenditure has changed, which is a part of your fiscal policy, or the taxes have been changed, which is again a part of your fiscal policy. So M by P, that is only money supply is changing, it can increase, it can decrease. Let us say if there is an expansionary monetary policy, so your money supply will go up, so it will positively impact. Government expenditure, let us say it's an expansionary fiscal policy, so your G will increase. If it's an expansionary fiscal policy, tax will decrease. So we will see the impact of expansionary policy and how does it have an impact on your aggregate demand curve, how does it shift it. So before moving forward, I again repeat, a shift in aggregate demand curve will take place because other exogenous factors due to the operation of monetary policy or fiscal policy is there, but the price level is constant. This will lead to a shift in your aggregate demand curve. How it happens, we will just see it graphically. Let us assume, let us see these two graphs. Please pay attention to these two graphs which are given to you. You have an equilibrium given by IS equal to LM. LM is your money market curve. We are talking about M1, means this is this money supply M1, nominal money supply. This we are dividing by the aggregate price level P1. And at this point, your rate of interest is R1, that is an equilibrium rate of interest, and equilibrium level of output is Y1. This equilibrium level of output Y1 is corresponding to this Y1 P1 in your AD curve. Now, if there is a change in money supply, we have just said it will lead to a shift in the aggregate demand curve. For example, let us say if money supply increases, if the monetary authorities, if they decide to have an expansion in the money supply, so they increase this money supply. An increase in money supply, we have done in the previous lectures when we understood the LM curve and the shifts which take place. Please go back to that lecture and revise. Your increase in money supply will shift the LM curve to the right. So you see a new LM curve being given by this green line. What do we see here is that this LM curve we have seen is a real money supply. Your money supply is M2. Instead of M1, it is M2, means money supply has changed, but your price level is still P1. So this real money supply we have calculated by dividing the new increased money supply by the existing price level P1. There is no change in price level, only changes in the money supply which has taken place because the monetary authorities have gone for an expansionary monetary policy, have increased the money supply. What will happen because of this? An expansionary monetary policy, increased money supply, will lead to a fall in the rate of interest. Why? Because money supply has increased, an excess supply of money has pushed down the rate of interest. A fall in the rate of interest will lead to a change in the demand of money in the money market. That is, because the rate of interest has changed, excess demand of money will be there because people would like to shift to demand more money for speculative purpose. So there will be an excess demand of money on one side in the money market, and on the other side, because the rate of interest has fallen, we will also see a push up in the demand of your investments. So at a lower rate of interest R2, your investments will also increase. When investments increase, you get to a new equilibrium where the rate of interest is R2, but the level of output would be Y2. So at each there will be an increase in y at each value of p. So what has happened is, because there was a monetary expansion, there was excess supply of money, demand of money also went up, and because there was a fall in rate of interest, investment also went up. So what do we see because of that is a new equilibrium is achieved when IS is equal to LM. Which LM? That is M2 divided by P1. Now this green Y2 means a new level of output which we have achieved by the new LM curve, which was because of increase in the money supply, and it gets intersected to IS at this point where rate of interest is R2 and a higher level of output Y2. Now if you see this Y2 and if you extend it to AD, what do we see? That this new combination P1Y2 is achieved, and if you want to go to this point, means your aggregate demand curve has shifted from AD1 to AD2 because the new level of Y2 which we achieved by new equilibrium of the money market and the goods market is at point price level P1 and output level Y2. So this expansionary monetary policy has shifted your aggregate demand curve outside. Means this has happened. This what does AD2 shows? It shows that at the original price level P1, we have a higher level of output Y2. If you see carefully, the previous AD curve shown by this black line AD1, price level was P1 and output level was Y1. So the combination was P1, Y1. But because there was an expansion in the monetary policy, there was an expansion in the money supply, we see a higher level of output at Y2. We have just seen that how did we get this? We saw a shift of LM and we got a new point V2, Y2. So the new combination of price and Y2 is will be get only when your AD curve shifts from 81 to 82. So what have we seen is that a change in monetary policy or change in money supply will shift your LM curve, which will lead to a shift in your aggregate demand curve. Again, this exercise I leave it with you. What will happen if the money supply will decrease? What will happen if the money supply will decrease? Next, we move to a shift in the aggregate demand curve due to a change in the fiscal policy. An expansionary fiscal policy, which we intend to say is that the government expenditure has increased and taxes or only taxes have decreased. So any change in the government expenditure and tax we know is a part of fiscal policy. An increase in government expenditure and a fall in tax rate, both together or maybe any one of them, will lead to an increase in aggregate demand and a shift in the aggregate demand curve. How? Let us see. Again, we go back to your money market and the goods market equilibrium. So let us say we have this equilibrium when IS1 is equal to LM at a rate of interest R1 corresponding to an equilibrium level of output Y1. When the equilibrium level of output was Y1, in the aggregate demand curve, we see the price level as P1. Now, an expansionary fiscal policy has taken place. Let us say taxes decrease. The government decreases the taxes, because of which your consumption will increase. Why consumption will increase? Because our disposable income has increased. With the fall in taxes, we have greater income in hand. Greater income in hand will lead to an increase in our consumption. With an increase in our consumption, we will see that this IS curve will shift to the right. It will shift outward. A greater shift of IS would mean that your Y will increase at each value of P. See, this IS curve has shifted outside. We see a new IS curve, IS2. This has happened because your taxes have fallen. A fall in taxes led you to buy more, consume more. So you get a new level of equilibrium at rate of interest R2 and a new level of output Y2. Of course, we have already talked about that Y rate of interest increases when we have an expansionary fiscal policy in the previous lectures. You can go back to it and revise. So R1 goes up to R2. Y1 level of output, we see an increased level of output because with an increase in the your government taxes, we see people consuming more. A multiplier effect we see here. So you get to a new level of output Y2 at the same level of P1. So you get a new combination of price and output, that is P1, Y2, which we see is not falling on the previous aggregate demand curve, but on a new aggregate demand curve, 82. So it has, because of an expansion in the fiscal policy, price level P1 now corresponds to a higher level of output Y2. So that has led to a shift in the aggregate demand curve from aggregate demand 1 to aggregate demand 2. So both fiscal policy and the monetary policy, if they are expansionary in nature, will lead to a shift in the aggregate demand curve to the right, to outside. And if it is vice versa, that is, if it is a contractionary fiscal policy or a contractionary monetary policy, we will see that the aggregate demand will shift inside. That is, at the initial price level, we will see a lower level of output. So, summarizing today's lecture, we have understood that the aggregate demand curve is a curve which captures an inverse relationship between aggregate price and output. That is, it is a downward sloping curve indicating at a higher level of prices output is less and at a lower level of prices output is more. We saw that the change in aggregate price level gets affected because there is a change in real money supply. We saw that how real money supply was changed or LM curve changed when the price level changed. This we saw by movement along the aggregate demand curve only. That is, any change in the prices led due to a movement on the same aggregate demand curve going up when the prices were more or going down on the same curve when the prices were less. In contrast to this, we saw a shift in the aggregate demand curve, an outward shift or an inward shift due to change in the fiscal policy or change in the monetary policy. So I hope you have understood that what is aggregate demand curve and how this curve shifts and how the impact of prices is there on the LM curve having a impact on your and deriving the aggregate demand curve. So that's all learners. Happy learning. Stay safe.